Imagine if Braveheart never hit the screen. This epic movie nearly didn't happen, and we could have gotten a totally different final version, from other stars possibly leading the film to major historical changes in the story. Let's explore the behind-the-scenes decisions that almost altered one of the most controversial and loved historical dramas ever made. Now, it's very likely that the idea for Braveheart just narrowly escaped becoming lost back in the early 90s. It all started when Alan Ladd Jr., an American film executive and producer, got the script while at MGM Path Communications. But when MGM's management changed in 1993, Ladd took Braveheart with him as he walked out the door. And it's a good thing he did. Often projects can fall through the cracks during company mergers or even changes in leadership. Now, when Mel Gibson found the script, he liked it, but he didn't jump on it right away. It kept bugging him, though, and finally he decided to try and do the story justice. But what if he had chosen to pass up on such a monumental project? Any doubts in his mind could have changed everything. At first, Gibson didn't even want to be in front of the camera. He just wanted to direct. Can you picture Brad Pitt swinging a sword as Sir William Wallace? Or maybe Jason Patrick? Gibson considered both before he finally took on the role himself. But don't worry, Brad Pitt got his chance to play the sword-swinging hero just under 10 years later as Achilles in the massively successful Troy. And Sean Connery was nearly chosen as King Edward. Imagine that powerful voice and presence on the opposite side of Wallace. But Connery was too busy, and all he left Gibson was a tip on how to nail the Scottish accent by pronouncing goulash. Now, how then did Mel Gibson manage to get the funding for this epic? Raising money for the movie was quite an adventure. Gibson's production company, Icon Productions, struggled to secure enough funding. This isn't hard to believe, considering the final budget required around $70 million to complete the project. They may not seem like a lot by today's standards, but adjusted for inflation, that comes out to over $140 million in 2024. Warner Bros. Was willing to step in, but only if Gibson agreed to star in another Lethal Weapon film. Gibson refused the offer, though. Eventually, he struck a deal with Paramount Pictures and 20th Century Fox. Paramount agreed to finance a third of the budget in exchange for the North American rights, while Fox took care of the rest for the international rights. It's interesting to think how the funding could have turned out if Gibson had made other choices, and how another Lethal Weapon film starring Gibson would have been received by audiences. Braveheart was originally supposed to be filmed entirely in the UK, but plans took an unexpected turn. The Irish government made a strong case for shooting it in Ireland instead, and they even offered 1,600 members of the Irish Army Reserves as extras. This changed everything, and suddenly Ireland became the main filming location. The crew spent 12 weeks shooting at Ardmore Studios and across Ireland's scenic locations, with an additional 5 weeks in Scotland. Filming kicked off in June 6, 1994, and to keep costs down, Mel Gibson came up with the creative idea. He had the same extras play both the Scottish and English armies. These reservists simply swapped their gear and medieval costumes depending on what side they were shooting for that day, and even grew beards to fit their roles. Despite the massive scale of the production, filming wrapped up on schedule on October 28, 1994. Just 5 months after beginning. They captured those epic battle scenes and stunning landscapes using Panavision's anamorphic lenses, which really gave Braveheart its iconic look, and during one of the battle scenes, Gibson almost got trampled by a horse. Thankfully, his stunt double swooped in just in time to save him from getting seriously hurt. But Braveheart almost didn't make it to theaters as we know it. The battle scenes were so intense that they had to make major alterations, and the expansive runtime was quickly cut down. Braveheart really did get almost too intense for theaters. Mel Gibson had to dial back the battle scenes to dodge an NC-17 rating, ending up with an R rating for its brutal medieval warfare. Initially, the film ran for a whopping 195 minutes. That's over 3 hours of swords clashing and dramatic speeches. However, Sherry Lansing, the head honcho at Paramount Pictures at the time, wasn't having it. She asked Gibson and his editor Stephen Rosenblum to trim it down to 177 minutes to keep it from overstaying its welcome in theaters. But according to a 2016 interview with Gibson, there's a 4-hour director's cut lurking around somewhere. Gibson mentioned he'd love to put it back together if Paramount Pictures and 20th Century Fox are on board. Imagine what those extra 47 minutes might hold. More fierce battles, deeper characters, or unseen twists in the tale of William Wallace. But what about the history behind the film? Braveheart is an epic historical drama, but how much of it really happened? Let's take a closer look at where the movie bends the truth, and whether or not the real events that took place would have made for a better movie. Randall Wallace, who wrote the script for Braveheart, was hugely inspired by a 15th century poem by Blind Harry. telling tales about Sir William Wallace. Randall Wallace openly admitted he wasn't sure how true Blind Harry's stories were, but he loved how they resonated with him emotionally. That's what drove him to write the film. Despite its stirring narrative, Braveheart has been called out for playing loose with the facts. Elizabeth Ewan, a critic, said the movie pretty much throws historical accuracy out the window to ramp up the epic adventure. It's actually listed as one of the most historically inaccurate films out there. For instance, some elements like the hanging of Scottish nobles are lifted from Blind Harry's poem, but then the movie takes liberties, like inventing an affair between Wallace and Princess Isabella, which isn't found in any historical records or the poem. Sharon Crosa, a historian, also highlighted some big mistakes, especially with costumes. The Scots in the movies wear belted plaids and kilts way too early. Think of it as showing men in colonial America wearing modern suits but worn backward. Crosa summed it up by saying, the events aren't accurate, the dates aren't accurate, the characters aren't accurate, the names aren't accurate, the clothes aren't accurate. In short, just about nothing is accurate. Peter Traquair, another historian, mocked the film for its portrayal of Wallace, depicting him like a wild Highlander smeared with a woad and wearing a tartan kilt. Styles from totally different eras. Carolyn White from The Times dubbed the film a litany of fibs. Other than that, John O'Farrell even joked in his book, An Utterly Impartial History of Britain, that the film could have thrown in a plastic-made dog and renamed it William Wallace and Gromit, and it wouldn't have been any less accurate. Mel Gibson, who directed and starred in the film, isn't denying any of this. On the Braveheart DVD audio commentary, he admits they tweaked the history. But why? Because, according to Gibson, making those changes turned the real-life story into something way more exciting and dramatic on screen. One of the biggest historical stretches in the movie is the whole jus primae noctis thing, where Edward Longshanks claims he has the right to spend the night with the newlywed daughters of his serf. Scholars are pretty much in agreement here. There's no solid evidence that was ever a thing. Historians say it's a myth, and they point out that those who mention it rarely back it up with any reliable sources. Braveheart also gives a dramatic version of Scotland's history, suggesting that Scotland was under English control during William Wallace's entire childhood. But Scotland only fell under English invasion a year before Wallace kicked off his rebellion. Until then, it was its own kingdom, doing its own thing until King Alexander III passed away in 1286. Now, let's talk about William Wallace himself. The movie shows him as a heroic commoner from the Highlands. But that's not quite right. Historians like Matt Ewart tells us Wallace was actually a part of the Scottish gentry. Yeah, he was kind of a big deal. He lived a pretty stable life until things got personal. He was 27 when he avenged his wife's murder by killing the sheriff of Lanark. He did lead a successful charge at Stirling and even got named Guardian of Scotland for a bit. But after a tough year with some military setbacks, he stepped down and later spent some time in France before being captured and executed by the English. A scholar points out that the film totally skips over Wallace's real background. Instead of showing him as well-educated and connected, with ties to European cities like Lubeck and Hamburg, the film opts for a simpler story. They make him out to be a man of the people, a farmer at heart, not the well-to-do nobleman he actually was. Colin MacArthur doesn't hold back when he talks about Braveheart. He argues that the movie makes William Wallace look like a modern-day guerrilla leader, which is a bit of a stretch since nationalism didn't even exist back then. He also points out that the film leaves out some uncomfortable facts, like Wallace trying to make peace with King Edward I after losing a battle and forcing men to fight for him. He even executed those who refused. Then there's Isabella of France. In the movie, she's shown getting close to Wallace and even hints that she's carrying his child, who could become the future Edward III. But here's the thing, in real life, Isabella was just a kid living in France when the Battle of Falkirk happened. She didn't marry Edward II until years after Wallace had died. She did help overthrow Edward II eventually, but that was more than 20 years later, not during Wallace's lifetime. Robert the Bruce's character is also a bit off in the movie. The film shows him switching sides a few times, which is somewhat true. He did change allegiances early on in the Scottish Wars of Independence, but the idea that he fought against the Scots at Falkirk? That's not really backed up by history. And the Battle of Bannockburn? The movie makes it seem like it happened right after Wallace's execution, but in reality, Bruce had been leading the fight for 8 years by that point. Oh, and the film calls him the Earl of Bruce, when he was actually the Earl of Carrick. And when it comes to the royals, the movie doesn't do them any favors either. Edward I, or Longshanks, is portrayed as a total villain, but it leaves out the fact that he actually loved poetry, music, and was deeply religious. His son Edward II is shown in a pretty unflattering light, which led to accusations of homophobia. Mel Gibson defended the portrayal by saying it was historically accurate, but it's still a controversial point. We've seen the epic battles on screen, but how accurate were they? Did Wallace really fight the way the movie shows? Well, for example, at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. There's no bridge in the movie, even though the bridge was key to the Scots' victory. When asked, Gibson responded that he desired for the battle scenes to be cinematically compelling, rather than accurate to the real-life events. Also, Wallace's raid into England is blown out of proportion. He never got close to York, and he definitely didn't kill the king's nephew. Oh, and those Irish conscripts at Falkirk? Not true. Most of Edward's soldiers were actually Welsh. Lastly, the weapons. Wallace almost exclusively swings around this massive two-handed sword in the movie, but back then a one-handed sword and a shield would have been way more common, especially when you're up against an army full of archers. The actual two-handed sword said to have been used by Wallace himself is currently housed in a museum, but there's no actual evidence linking him to the weapon. It's all speculation. So, did the liberties taken during the production of the movie make for a better story? Do the historical inaccuracies take the audience out of the moment? Or are we even more captivated by the wonder and imagination of it all? Well, that decision is ultimately up to you. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button for more deep dives into your favorite movies. We'll see you next time.